Welcome to episode 133 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we complete our discussion of Epicurus' letter to Pythocles. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
Comets occur either when fire is collected together in certain regions at certain intervals of time in the upper air because some gathering of matter takes place, or when at certain intervals the heaven above us has some peculiar movement, so that stars of this nature are revealed, or when they themselves at certain seasons start to move on account of some gathering of matter and come into the regions within our ken and appear visible, and their disappearance occurs owing to the opposite causes to these. Some stars revolve in their place, as Homer says, which comes to pass not only because this part of the world is stationary, and round it the rest revolves, as some say, but also because a whirl of air is formed in a ring round it, which prevents their moving about as do the other stars, or else it is because there is not a succession of appropriate fuel for them, but only in this place in which they are seen fixed. And there are many other ways in which this may be brought about, if one is able to infer what is in agreement with phenomena. That some of the stars should wander in their course, if indeed it is the case that their movements are such, while others do not move in this manner, may be due to the reason that from the first, as they moved in their circles, they were so constrained by necessity that some of them move along the same regular orbit, and others along one which is associated with certain irregularities. Or it may be that among the regions to which they are carried, in some places there are regular tracks of air, which urge them on successively in the same direction and provide flame for them regularly, while in other places the tracks are irregular, so that the aberrations which we observe result. But to assign a single cause for these occurrences, when phenomena demand several explanations, is madness, and is quite wrongly practiced by persons who are partisans of the foolish notions of astrology, by which they give futile explanations of the causes of certain occurrences, and all the time do not by any means free the divine nature from the burden of responsibilities. That some stars should be seen to be left behind by others is caused because, though they move around in the same orbit, they are carried along more slowly, and also because they really move in the opposite direction, though they are dragged back by the same revolution. Also because some are carried round through a greater space, and some through a lesser, though all perform the same revolution. But to give a single explanation of these occurrences is only suitable to those who wish to make a show to the many. What are called falling stars may be produced in part by the rubbing of star against star, and by the falling out of the fragments wherever an outburst of wind occurs, as we explained in the case of lightning flashes, or else by the meeting of atoms produced of fire, when a gathering of kindred material occurs to cause this, and a movement in the direction of the impulse which results from the original meeting, or else by a gathering of wind in certain dense and misty formations, and its ignition as it whirls around, and then its bursting out of what encloses it, and its rush towards the spot to which the impulse of its flight tends. And there are other ways in which this result may be brought about, quite free from superstition. The signs of the weather, which are given by certain animals, result from mere coincidence of occasion, for the animals do not exert any compulsion for winter to come to an end, nor is there some divine nature which sits and watches the outgoings of these animals and then fulfills the signs they give. For not even the lowest animal, although a small thing gives the greatest pleasure, would be seized by such foolishness, much less one who was possessed of perfect happiness. All these things, Pythocles, you must bear in mind, for thus you will escape in most things from superstition, and will be enabled to understand what is akin to them. And most of all, give yourself up to the study of the beginnings and of infinity and of things akin to them, and also of the criteria of truth, and of the feelings, and of the purpose for which we reason out these things. For these points, when they are thoroughly studied, will most easily enable you to understand the causes of the details. But those who have not thoroughly taken these things to heart could not rightly study them in themselves, nor have they made their own reason for observing them.
Okay, Joshua, thank you for reading that for us today. We are going to complete our study of the letter to Pythocles today, and we've got some more detailed science of stars and motions of things in the sky that we can talk about. But as we close the book, there's some really good summary material here, points on epistemology that I think we want to make sure we cover with as much detail as we feel is necessary. And before we even get into that, we have been reading the Cyril Bailey edition of the letter to Pythocles, his translation of it. And just my personal view of Cyril Bailey is that he's sometimes not the most reliable translator, just like everybody does. He tends to correct things maybe a little bit more aggressively than some others do. And here at the very end of the letter, there's a very memorable line that in getting ready for today's episode, I see he is translated much differently than Hicks, who is probably a more popular version. And it is line 116, basically. And what Joshua has read, let me read the Hicks version of that. The fact that the weather is sometimes foretold from the behavior of certain animals is a mere coincidence in time, for the animals offer no necessary reason why a storm should be produced, and no divine being sits observing when these animals go out and afterwards fulfilling the signs which they have given. And here's the part that's significantly different. Hicks says, "For such folly as this would not possess the most ordinary being, if ever so little enlightened, much less one who enjoys perfect felicity." And we have some notes that our friend Don has added into the thread for today's episode for anybody who wants to read more into that. But apparently Bailey has decided that there was some quotation involved here when he says a small thing gives the greater pleasure. And that is not the way that most translators translate that line 116. They say, "For such folly as this would not possess the most ordinary being, if ever so little enlightened, much less one who enjoys perfect felicity." So that's kind of a reminder that just as in everything, every one of these lines can be parsed and studied in detail, and different interpretations and translations can sometimes be pulled out of them. So you always have to be very careful with putting too much reliance on a single translation and a single verse. And it's always probably better to compare everything with the big picture to see if you're reaching a consistent result. But at any rate, I wanted to say that before we get started. So as we get towards the end of what Joshua has read today, the epistemology sections, I think, jump out. But before we get to that section, though, there are statements about comets and about stars and how they revolve and how some of them wander. Anybody want to comment in particular about our opening paragraph or 112 or 113?
I think that comets present a particular difficulty, particularly for someone operating in the 4th or 3rd century BC. And that's because comets have a very peculiar way of presenting themselves. And it has to do with, what do they call it? The periodicity or something. The length of time before the comet is going to reappear. And that can be thousands or 10,000s of years. So when it appears to someone who doesn't quite understand the functioning of comets or what they are, it appears as this anomaly in the sky. And it might just hang in the sky for as long as, several months, and then it just goes away. And in an environment where everything that happens in the sky is going to be attributed to the gods, this becomes, for some people, it could be seen as auspicious. For some people, this could be seen as a warning of impending doom. But it's always anomalous, and it always, in that time, I think, defies explanation. And so it's not surprising to me that that really nobody at the time, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody did have a better idea, but nobody really has an idea of what's going on with comets. And one thing I wanted to point out, because it's interesting to me, is that if you were a person who enjoys wine, then you may be familiar with what they call comet vintages. Comet vintages are particularly good grape harvests and vintages of wine that are thought to occur in the year following a comet. Even today, you'll see comet vintages are sold. There was a comet vintage in 1811, which was considered to have been like the greatest wine vintage of all time. There is no connection, or you can't trace a connection between a comet being in the sky and a particularly good grape harvest. I doubt seriously whether there is any connection, but this is the kind of thing that people will attribute to something that otherwise might just be a random coincidence. And so that this still goes on today should tell you something about what was going on in the ancient world to an even greater degree when something like a comet appears in the sky.
Yeah, comets can be pretty dramatic. On the other hand, it seems to me in my life, every time somebody says there's some comet coming, I'm always extremely disappointed with what I see in the sky, if I see anything at all. But I guess sometimes they can be very dramatic. I don't guess, Martin, have you had any dramatic observations of comets or anything much to say about them?
No. So I think I saw one, but for very distant, is where I saw was hardly worth to mention.
Yeah, Halley's Comet is always the most famous one. What is that? Something like 75 years or something like that. And I seem to remember was it 5 or 10, 15 years ago? Maybe it was worth watching, but I don't remember. Joshua, do you remember Halley's Comet coming?
I was reading all about comets last night, and I was trying to figure out when the next good one was coming. It's actually surprisingly not very easy, even today, to figure out when a good comet is going to be coming, because you kind of know when they're going to be at a certain place in the solar system. What you can't foretell very easily is how bright they're going to appear on Earth when they do come around. So I think one of the best recent comets was in 1996, at which point I would have been 8 years old, and that was Hale-Bopp.
Yeah, that was more exciting than Halley's, if I remember correctly, to me. I could finally see a tail. Most of these things, I can't even really see a tail most of the time, but I think Hale-Bopp, I could see the tail. But I interrupted you, Joshua.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out when is it Halley's Comet or Halley's Comet?
Halley, it could be Halley. Mm-hmm.
It last appeared in the inner parts of the solar system in 1986. So that was 2 years before I was born. So I have not really seen a good comet in my lifetime. I'm sure I've seen a comet.
Yeah.
And that's like what I'm saying is they've got such a long span before they circle back around that when they do appear, it's such an anomalous and particularly for people living in these very early ages of history, it's a unpredictable thing and portends disaster usually.
Well, what about the movement of the stars and their wanderings and so forth?
We were talking a little bit about this before we started recording. What I should have done was gone to the Greek, because we've got 2 paragraphs here on the movement of stars. You've got in 112, he talks about how Homer describes certain stars as revolving in their place. It's not clear to me what he's actually referring to here. And then you've got in line 113, some of the stars wander in their course. And I have to assume that there he's talking about planets, because as I've mentioned before on the podcast, the Greek word for planet, planetos, means wanderer. But do we know what he's talking about when he says stars revolve in their place? It's, I think, very difficult to parse the Epicurean idea of the universe, because in some ways it seems so modern and so extraordinary that they would come up with this. In some ways it seems like they didn't have a cohesive understanding of how it worked. And really they couldn't have, because I think the essential ingredient in our understanding of the formation and the operation of the universe is gravity. And if you don't have this understanding that gravity is a force, it's just not possible to come up with something that makes a whole lot of sense and that it stands the test of time. It just occurred to me as I was talking about that, I think maybe what he's talking about in terms of stars that revolve in their place, he could be talking about the North Star, Polaris, because that's a star that, while all the other stars appear to revolve around it, that star is actually fixed in one spot. To the human eye, it's fixed. But even there, it's, the North Star Polaris has been the North Star for, I think, basically all of human civilization. Maybe there was a very early period when it was a different star, but that won't always be the case. There will come a time when, due to this wobbling of the Earth around its axis called precession, is that it?
I think so, precession.
Yeah. So because of that, there will come a time when the North Star is no longer fixed in the sky, or no longer appears to be fixed. It will be a different star that is the North Star.
Martin, were you about to say something?
No.
Martin, I'm beginning to detect that maybe astronomy is not as much of an interest for you as physics.
Yeah, astronomy is only at the sideline of me, so I'm more motivated by others.
Well, for purposes of what we're talking about here in the podcast, I guess the big thing to note is that he's talked about comets and stars, and then some of the stars wandering, which would presumably be the planets. But in each of these paragraphs, he's giving it at least two, it looks like, possible explanations that would explain what we see above. And so he's continuing with his method of multiple explanations that are consistent with the evidence. And then he gets at the end of 113 back to the issue of the way to analyze these things is that, but to assign a single cause when phenomena demand several explanations is madness. And he's very emphatic about the error of this. Not only is it madness, but it's quite wrongly practiced by persons who are partisans of the foolish notions of astrology, by which they give futile explanations and don't end up having a good explanation that tells that the divine nature is not responsible for it. And while it goes into 114 to say this, he also refers to people like this as those who wish to make a show to the many, as if they're trying to inflate their own egos and their own reputations by looking certain when they really should not be certain. But this is one of the sections of the closing of Pythocles that gets us back to his original points about not taking a position of certainty when the facts do not support it.
That's right. And what it turns into later is this guy I've mentioned many times, Giordano Bruno, who took what Epicurus was thinking, took what Copernicus was thinking, and was able to come up with a far more maybe accurate understanding of the universe. And so I guess the idea here is that don't become beholden to just one idea of how these things work. Even the way he phrases some of the claims here, he says that some of the stars should wander in their course if indeed it is the case that their movements are such. So he's allowing here for the possibility that what we think is going on by observation in the sky, this may be an artifact, as I would put it, of our perspective. We're on an Earth that is revolving. He didn't come up with that idea, I don't think, but we're on an Earth that is revolving. So the stars don't actually move through the sky. The appearance that they are moving through the sky is caused by the rotation of the Earth. And so not just that there's one explanation for what we see, but that what we see is not necessarily accurate to what's going on. And if you could take a different position in the solar system, you would see things from a very, very different perspective. And this is so much of his epistemology, which is that the senses accurately report to us the information that they gather. The error is the assumption that we make that happens in our mind after the senses have reported the information to us. So when you see the stars that appear to revolve around the Earth, the assumption then is that that's actually what's happening. When in fact, if you could change your position in the universe, you would see that, if I go to a different planet, then the stars will appear to revolve around that planet if that planet rotates.
Right, Joshua. And what you said a moment ago too, I would really emphasize. I think you can see a big distinction between when he talks about the theories of the comets and the stars' rotations and so forth. Just his tone, the words he's using seem to make clear that he knows that he's just speculating. He knows that he can't be confident that what he's saying is the only single explanation for what's going on. And at least as I read it, and of course we were talking about how you can't put too much faith in any single translation. You ought to compare the words as closely as you can. But in contrast with discussions of these things that he knows that there's multiple explanations. When he gets back to his epistemology rule, he's extremely emphatic. And he's saying that when you put a single cause, when the phenomenon demands several explanations, you're mad to do that, and that it's foolishness, and that it is only suitable for those who want to make a show to the many. So to me, I see a major wording difference too, that he's very confident of his epistemology rule, that if the evidence does not support it, then you don't make the claim. And if the evidence supports multiple possibilities, then you give each multiple possibility the same status of a possibility. And about that aspect of it, he's very firm. Once again, it's this distinction against radical skepticism of a radical skeptic who would just continue to say, I don't know anything, including whether I know anything or not. That skepticism does not extend to his rules of knowledge, because he has a firm rule of examining the evidence scientifically and coming back to the conclusions that the evidence supports. He can be very firm about the rule, and in certain instances, he'll be firm about the application. If it's something that's close to us, that we have ability to verify the details and our experiments are repeatable over and over and over again, he does come back to a very strong sense of confidence in that conclusion. So I think some people have a difficulty with the idea that it seems like like a pendulum. They go from radical skepticism, and if they get tired of radical skepticism, they become some kind of a religious fanatic and think that everything is absolutely set by God, or nothing is set by God if they go back to the skeptic side. But Epicurus is, I think, pointing away not necessarily to a middle position, but to a logically correct position that nature gave us our senses to go by, to gather evidence. We should gather that evidence and evaluate it rationally and come to a sound conclusion. And that is our goal. And we should not just rotate back and forth between radical skepticism. And I don't know what the opposite of radical skepticism is, really. I'm using fundamental religion as the opposite. It's not exactly the opposite, I guess, but arbitrariness, just arbitrary and capricious selection of some particular one method. I mean, this is one of to me, a major attraction of Epicurean philosophy, that it gives a rational approach to the use of evidence.
Yeah, and there's one more thing going on here in addition to hardline skepticism and religious revelation. You do have in the ancient world earlier attempts to understand nature and what's going on in the sky and how things work. We want to understand these things because we don't want to be at the mercy of them. And even the Epicurean view of nature is only one step in an incremental approach to scientific inquiry that has just kept on advancing the entire time that's elapsed since Epicurus wrote. And it was advancing after he wrote, but it was also advancing before he wrote in some very peculiar and unusual ways. And one of those ways is something that he talks about here, which is partisans of the foolish notions of astrology. I guess I share the sort of barbed sentiment there that this, astrology is something ridiculous and absurd, and we shouldn't give it our time. But I did read a book within the last few years called The Rise and Fall of Alexandria by Justin Pollard and Howard Reed. And one of the things they do a very good job of is challenging our understanding of how humans begin to systematize their understanding of nature. And so the way they present astrology in that is that while it's, I think maybe laughable to most people today, or most people who care about good explanations, in the ancient world, what it partially represented was an effort by humans to take just a little bit of that understanding from the gods for themselves. Because there's two approaches, right? If you think that things are supernatural and that religion is the explanation and that revealed truth is the only thing you need to know, there's two approaches here. One of them is to take the view that, as the book of Genesis seems to suggest, which is that things like, for example, the knowledge of good and evil and the way the universe works and the nature of human sexuality, even, that things are not meant to be understood by us. These are the province of God, and we shouldn't even meddle in them. This is more or less God's command in the book of Genesis, and yet astrology represents something very different. Astrology represents an early effort to, while granting the same premise, essentially, that it is all done by the gods, astrology represents an early effort to systemize everything that we think we know about this divine machinery and to use our systematic knowledge in a way that benefits us. Now, it turned out that they were, I think, completely wrong about astrology. But in many ways, some of Epicurus's explanations have turned out to be wrong. So between what I'm saying is that between the hardline skeptic and revelation, there's this separate sort of stairway of understanding, and every generation takes another step up the stairway. Well, that's not necessarily the case, is it? Because sometimes the stairway goes back down again, historically. But what Epicurus represented for me was a very big step for human understanding of nature and of how it worked. And the credit goes not just to Epicurus, of course, but to his predecessors, particularly Democritus.
Okay, as we go further into the end of the letter at section 115, there is a comment about falling stars, which I was thinking earlier as we were discussing comets, whether there was a distinction between comets and I guess some people call those shooting stars maybe. But falling stars, I guess, I don't know if they knew about meteorites back then or not, but is a falling star something that is what we would call something that eventually hits the Earth?
It depends. Most of them actually evaporate, so they don't reach the surface of the Earth. But I think because of that coincidence, I'm pretty sure that the ancients were aware of that. Sometimes after observation of a falling star, they find a meteorite where it apparently came down. And also, if you find it when it's fresh, it must be really dramatic. So then you see. Then you may see splinters of small diamond crystals around. Not sure whether you see them with bare eyes, no? but then the crater it forms, and if you really come in fresh, it's still hot. So that should be rather dramatic.
Right. And in talking about the falling stars, he says, and there are other ways in which this result may be brought about quite free from superstition. So as he is nearing the end of his letter, he's returning to talking about each observation and then sort of closing that section with a comment about the epistemology aspect of it. Well, why don't we, as we begin to close into these final paragraphs here, my eye is now catching something else that I don't like in this Bailey translation. And I'm about to myself, I think, move down to the Hicks version of it, because I see in the second sentence of 116, Bailey has, all these things, Pythocles, you must bear in mind, for thus you will escape in most things from superstition. Well, I don't know why Bailey says most things. I would like to escape from almost everything in superstition. And I see that Hicks has translated that differently. He says, all this, Pythocles, you should keep in mind, for then you will escape a long way from myth, and you will be able to view in this connection the instances which are similar to these. So I have to say, as we close this letter out, the Hicks version is the one that's sticking in my mind. But it looks like the last example that he's giving is the falling star in 115. And then he's going to turn to the fact that the weather is sometimes foretold by the behavior of animals. And with that, he begins closing out, and a final paragraph that I think we really need to spend some time with. But let's go back. I know at the opening of the session, I pointed out this issue about the discrepancy in the translation about the behavior of animals and how Bailey translates 116. But let's talk about for a few minutes. The weather is sometimes foretold from the behavior of certain animals as a mere coincidence in time, for the animals offer no necessary reason why a storm should be produced, and no divine being sits observing these animals, and when they go out and afterwards fulfills the signs which they have given. For such a folly as this would not possess the most ordinary being, if ever so enlightened, much less one who enjoys perfect felicity. Again, that's what I think of as a very emphatic hammering home of the point that the gods are not creating these weather events as signs or for any other reason. The gods aren't.
And that the arrival of the animal does not cause the change. That's also a part of it. You know, if you see a robin, we tend to think that a robin is associated with the coming of spring, at least where I grew up. And it's not that the robin is carrying the spring on his back, as I think it's sometimes been poetically described. It's not that the arrival of the robin causes it to be springtime. It's the arrival of springtime due to things going on in the broader solar system. It's because of that the robin has this instinct to migrate back north again. And I didn't even think of that angle. I was reading last night on this, and I thought there's the idea that, animals perceive things happening weather-wise before we do. I think that's true. But the idea that animals cause the things that they seem to foretell is the idea that he seems to be rejecting decisively here.
It's a bit funny that he does not think about that animals might sense weather and then react in some way that we can use it to predict. So he really states just a mere coincidence, and not that they may actually sense the weather change.
Yeah. Or that the change in temperature allows them to expand the area that they move into, that kind of stuff. So, it's not necessarily a coincidence that the robin arrives in springtime. It's that the robin proceeds north with the warmer weather.
The word coincidence, it has sort of the implication that it's random, but I guess you could also use the word coincidence to just simply observe that the two things are happening at the same time without taking any position at all as to why they're happening.
But the way it's formulated here, it indicates that it is independent.
Yeah.
That is a bit weird. So why he would not consider the possibility that it's not just a coincidence.
Yeah. I mean, I would think it would be pretty obvious even then that, like examples like dogs maybe having better hearing than we do, things like that. So they ought to have understood that some animals are more sensitive than we are.
Certainly any maritime civilization will have certain birds that they will blame storms on, the stormy petrel or whatever, that when you see one of these, that this is a bad omen, that you're going to get bad weather.
Yep. Well, let's tackle this final paragraph here, which packs a lot into it. I'll just repeat the Hicks version again. All this, Pythocles, you should keep in mind, for then you will escape a long way from myth, and you'll be able to view in their connection the instances which are similar to these. Okay, well, that's maybe the same point we've been talking about for a while in terms of escaping a long way from myth. But this is the part that goes into something new, perhaps. But above all, give yourself up to the study of first principles and of infinity and of kindred subjects, and further of the standards and of the feelings and of the end for which we choose between them. For to study these subjects together will easily enable you to understand the causes of the particular phenomena. And those who have not fully accepted this, in proportion as they have not done so, will be ill acquainted with these very subjects, nor have they secured the end for which they ought to be studied. The summary and ending of the whole letter to Pythocles.
And like most of the letter to Pythocles, it's the summary of a handbook that does not teach you what to think, but teaches you how to think. You were in an earlier episode, Cassius, you mentioned that this book should be called "I'm going to teach you how to think," and I'm going to use nature as an example or as a teaching tool. But the real meat of the letter that we're reading here is not just to learn what causes weather, what causes the motion of the stars. It's to learn how we should interpret things that our senses provide to us and how we should analyze nature as we study it.
And it's interesting that he's pretty specific here about the aspects of nature that he's suggesting that we study. And the first one that he lists here, and most of all, and I'm flipping back and forth between Bailey and Hicks, most of all, give yourself up to the study of the beginnings and of infinity and of the things akin to them. Let's discuss each of these major clauses in this sentence here. So when he says, give yourself up to the study of the beginnings and of infinity, what does that evoke in your mind that he's suggesting?
For beginnings, or as Hicks calls it, first principles, I guess it's hard not to read into this an allusion to the atoms and the void as being, the word beginning doesn't really convey the idea very well, because the atoms and the void are beginningless in Epicurean physics. But
they're the beginning of everything we see around us.
Yeah, the seeds of things, as Lucretius calls them. First beginnings, he also calls them. And then the second thing he mentions is the infinity, both of space and of time, that the atoms move around in, and the infinite number of the atoms. So he's at the very end of the letter here, he's taking you back to sort of the ground, the first thing that you learn in Epicurean physics, which is that the world is made of atoms and void, and that the void is infinite in extent, the atoms are infinite in number, and that both of them are eternal, from everlasting to everlasting.
I can't emphasize that enough in my own mind about Epicurean philosophy. I think that's the connection between the physics and the ethics and everything else, is that once you come to a confident position that the nature of the universe is natural and that there's no heaven and hell, that there's no supernatural God ordering things around, and that everything comes from atoms and returns to atoms and is constantly changing, and that there's an infinity of time ahead of the universe, but not before us as individuals, that we're going to be dead and we're going to, for an eternity, no longer exist. Those perspectives to me are incredibly important, and they impel you towards conclusions about how to live your life, that you're not going to be here forever. You're not going to go to heaven or hell. And so you darn well better make the most of the time that you have. And I think that we're regularly reminding yourself of that is a very good idea, that you don't lose track of that context, because everything that you do happens within that context. And it's very easy to forget the big picture when you get consumed in the details of everyday life. And so if you move to the second one in that list, he says, and also of the criteria of truth and of the feelings and of the purpose for which we reason out these things. Or the way Hicks says it is pretty similar. And further, the standards and of the feelings and of the end for which we choose between them.
So what we have here at the very end is sort of a summary of the major points of the whole philosophy, not just about nature and how we study nature, but also about the feelings and how we live and how we decide what we think is true. And he goes on to say, for to study these subjects together will easily enable you to understand the causes of the particular phenomena. This is what Pythocles has asked for, right? He's asked for a letter that will explain to him in an easy to understand way the causes of phenomena and how we should think about them. But he goes on to say here, and those who have not fully accepted this in proportion as they have not done so will be ill-acquainted with these very subjects, nor have they secured the end for which they ought to be studied. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the end for which they ought to be studied, because what Lucretius says in a certain line of his poem, he says that life is one long struggle in the dark. So the goal, in taking that as a point of departure, is to try to shed some light on life, on nature, on how we should live. And that seems to me to be what he's concluding the letter to Pythocles with. You see it also at the end of the Torquatus material. It's something that we return back to again and again. And that's part of how the ancient Epicureans decided to present information, was to indulge in quite a number of summaries and summaries within summaries. And at the end of a letter to give the higher level conclusions at the very end and to explain how they relate to what we've been talking about in the letter more broadly.
And I don't know that I heard you use the word pleasure there in what you just said, but I think that's what he's pointing back to, is that it's pretty clear in numerous sources that Epicurus is ultimately concluding that nature has given us nothing but pleasure and pain by which to make any of our decisions, and that pleasure is the positive side of nature's promptings. And so pursuing pleasure is one way of understanding the goal of life, or the greatest good of life. And when you've come to that conclusion, then you've got to talk about how you practically going to pursue pleasure. And what I read him saying here today is that it is absolutely essential in understanding that goal and in pursuing the goal too, that you educate yourself about these issues that he's talking about, because it's impossible to have peace of mind on many of these issues if you think that the gods could be behind them. If you think that you could be going to heaven or hell, if you think that there is a supernatural direction to the universe, that's going to lead you in a totally different direction than if you don't think that. And so in proportion as you do not study science and come to these conclusions about the natural basis of the universe, you're not going to be acquainted with these subjects. You're not going to have confidence in dealing with them. And even the amount of time that you do spend talking about them, it's going to be wasted because you're not understanding the goal and how you need to internalize it within yourself. I'm looking at the difference between Hicks and Bailey. Hicks says, nor have they secured the end. I actually may like Bailey better on this one, nor have they made their own the reason for observing. I mean, and I kind of like the made their own there. I think what he's saying here is you have to study this so that it becomes second nature to you, or first nature. You have to internalize it so that it becomes your habitual method of approaching things. And you're never going to have that confident ability to deal with new situations unless you practice and unless you get used to this method. It's the method and not just the book learning, because you can read books all day long and you can have somebody present things to you all day long. But if you don't understand it, you're not going to have confidence in the reasoning behind it. And the only way you can have confidence in the reasoning behind it is to study it yourself. When he says also the criteria of truth and of the feelings, we talk about the canon of truth and the basic Epicurean epistemology of the senses, the feelings, and the anticipations being listed as the three legs of the Epicurean canon, at least according to Diogenes Laertius anyway. And of the feelings, he says here, I don't know exactly how that should be worded, but he's pointing back to that fundamental position that truth in Epicurean terms to us comes from our application of those qualities or those faculties that nature has given to us.
I do quite like the ending passage here, and I think it's beneficial. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that we've had a little bit of difficulty, particularly with the letter to Pythocles. I think this is probably the hardest thing that we've gone over in my time on the podcast. And what I would say to that is simply that if you discard the letter to Pythocles, or if you think that this is too boring, or it's all been superseded by modern science, or that it's just not worth your time, there's quite a lot of very good stuff in here that you miss out on. And I think that this conclusion here at the very end is one of the things that you miss out on. And the epistemology that's all the way through the text is something that you miss out on. So it's, as Philodemus would prompt us to be, or goad us even, we have to be diligent with the books, and this is one of them. And even if it's difficult or we struggle with it a little bit, it's always going to be worthwhile to return to. And I'm saying that as much for myself as for anyone else, because I certainly have neglected the letter to Pythocles as well.
Yeah, Pythocles has larger percentage of raw commentary about stars and weather and things like that aren't all that exciting, and a lesser percentage of sort of key insightful statements about the methodology. But the ones that are here are maybe some of the best. I mean, that last paragraph stands out in my mind as one of the best paragraphs of any of the book, as a good summary of the direction that he's going in. And this example, or his wording sometimes here about his criticism of those who get enamored of the single cause. I guess this whole issue of the single cause is something that I've never really keyed on before as a key phrase, but assigning a single cause when the phenomenon demands several explanations is madness. The emphatic way that he presses that point home, I would say that's probably the things that stand out in my mind as what make the letter to Pythocles the most useful. But this phrasing here, although I stumble over the Bailey version, I like the Hicks version much better. The issue of how the gods do not sit around waiting and watching for the animals to do things and then fulfill the signs they give, and how the way Hicks says that folly such as this would not possess the most ordinary being, even if ever so enlightened, much less one who enjoys perfect felicity. For me, that's always been a very memorable and biting sarcasm against the religious point of view. So that section has always stood out at me as extremely memorable, as well as this final paragraph. But then the rest of the book, as we've been discussing as we went through it, it does have these epistemological observations about the problem of getting enamored of a single explanation. And, really, if you pull it out of the discussion of rain and hail and ice and sleet and so forth, getting enamored of a single explanation and ignoring the evidence when it leads in other directions, it's hard to get a bigger point than that in any aspect of the philosophy, because that certainly is a trap that people fall into in just about every area of life. So from that point of view, the letter to Pythocles is extremely useful. All the letters at the end have this final paragraph, this final section where he gets real explicit about being sure you continue in the study of these things. You have to line this up against the way he concludes the letter to Menicius and also the letter to Herodotus. And they're all kind of similar about how important it is to continue in this kind of a study. He doesn't say here with like-minded friends like he does in I think that's the letter to Menicius. And he doesn't say that this makes you a god among men like he says in the letter to Menicius, but he's hitting some very similar points in each of the three letters as he closes them about how important the continuing study is and how far off the beam you'll go if you don't do it.
And it might be for that reason that it's all the more surprising that Lucretius's poem ends the way it does, because he doesn't give that concluding summary view of the whole machinery of the philosophy.
Yes, each of these letters of Epicurus has a final summation, call to action kind of a statement that I think is very emphatically worded, dramatically worded, and insightful and incisive. And to some extent, you could just take these closing statements in these letters from Epicurus, and you've got an awful lot of dense material to think about just in those closings. Whereas in Lucretius, he ends up talking about piling dead bodies up on a pyre and burning them and so forth. But Joshua, I think you've done a very good job in discussing what's probably the method behind his madness in ending the book that way and having a challenge to be able to apply what he's been teaching in the earlier parts of the book. Maybe there's a different audience here in the sense that these letters of Epicurus are being written to, I've always had the impression, either younger people or students or people who were less knowledgeable about some of the things, although I guess he tells them in many cases that he's providing a summary. And it's almost like Lucretius, rather than providing a summary, is providing more of a challenge. That's that poetic thing. Poets go off in weird directions, a more emotional way of dealing with it than what Epicurus is doing here and providing a rational, here it is right in front of you position.
Yeah, I think the Iliad ends with the line, and so passed Hector, tamer of horses, or something like that. So there is a tendency in epic poetry in particular to start out in the middle and then to end in the middle. And then in either direction, the story continues to go on. Although Lucretius sort of breaks off from that in the beginning of his poem. He does start with his hymn to Venus, although that's another hallmark of epic poetry, so maybe I shouldn't quite go that far.
Something I've noted ever since I started studying is that the endings of these letters do seem to summarize where he's going and where he's been and provide just a lot of meaty information. That's the place we started the episode today. I was being critical of Bailey and how he came up with a translation of 116 that didn't seem consistent with what everybody else is doing, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense even. And so I was making the observation that you have to always test the details against the big picture that you've gotten from reading everything. And these summation statements at the ends of these letters to me have always provided sort of a big picture that you would then test the details against to make sure that your final understanding is a consistent whole. So we've basically completed the letter to Pythocles, and we'll talk for a minute about what we do from here. Our plan to our listeners is that we are going to go on straight through in order of the letters, and we're going to go to the letter to Menicius or Menicius, however you prefer to pronounce it, starting next week. And there we'll go back into something that's much more familiar with most of us in terms of the Epicurean ethics. But we've just been through two letters, Herodotus and Pythocles, that I think it's clear do provide the foundation, and they provide that perspective. by which you're then going to reach the conclusions of ethics and how to live. And that's what we've been saying in this episode, is that once you've decided that the universe is natural and not run by supernatural gods who are directing the motions of animals and human beings, then that your life is not going to continue indefinitely and you're not going to go to heaven or hell after you die. That it's always led me to a sort of a sense of urgency to, therefore, I better use the time I have as productively as possible. And that's what we'll turn to with the letter to Menorchius, is more detail from Epicurus on how to spend your time. Time for final thoughts for the day. And there we turn to Martin.
Yes. So I'm not sure whether we made this comment at the beginning of reading this letter, so that this letter, it seems, may not necessarily from Epicurus himself. It's also quite interesting that the German translator, from which I first read about it, he does not have this letter from Pythocles. What he called a letter to Pythocles is much shorter. It has just 2 sentences. That's it, and that doesn't occur in this one which we have read in the last several weeks. So that means this is a letter which clearly has the style of Epicurus' letter and way of writing letters, and it certainly is an expression of Epicurus' philosophy, but this is maybe a letter which was not written by Epicurus himself.
I'm glad you brought that up. We should definitely have already discussed that. I have read that to be the case too, that there's some who question the authenticity. Martin, if you have that in front of you, who is the German author whose reference book you're talking about?
It's Hans Wolfgang Krautz.
Okay, and that was published in what year? Is it a 20th century or before that?
1980.
1918 or 80?
80. So about
80.
40 years.
Okay, so that's a recent one to have come to that conclusion. Joshua, what is your understanding about that? You pretty commonly see this reference to that some people question its authenticity. I can't remember whether it's in Bailey or whether I've just seen a number of different references to that. But I've definitely seen what you're talking about, Martin, that some people question that. And I'm not frankly sure why.
I didn't see any explanation of him. And also when I searched, I didn't find any explanation why people doubt whether it's from Epicurus himself. I see it mentioned, but I didn't come to the source of this. No?
Well, that's something we can maybe pursue in the show notes and in the thread as time goes by, because I know I've seen exactly the same. Well, that's a very good comment, Martin. So thank you for bringing that up, because we should have commented on that at the very beginning. Anything else, Martin?
No, that was all.
Okay, very good. Joshua, your summary closing thoughts for today and for the letter to Pythocles.
I'm going to take the Martin route today and say that I have no closing thoughts.
Well, okay. So with that, I think we've treated the letter to Pythocles, and we will move on next week to the letter to Menorchius. And so in the meantime, we invite people who are listening to comment on the forum and join us again next week for the letter to Menorchius. And so we'll close for the day and come back next week. So thanks, guys, and talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Yeah. Talk to you soon.
Okay.